Eduarda, please.
Yes, okay, all right. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and I'm going to make a quick introduction of myself and the event, and then pass on to my friends who are here today, Hugo and Lily. But this panel today, we're having an opportunity to discuss geopolitics and connections and how we can, bring the world together, increase cooperation in the energy sector, and discuss some of the trending events and technologies in the space with different regional views. So I'm from Brazil, and we have Lily here who's from South Korea, and Hugo's from Nigeria. And the idea is to talk a little bit about our regions, how we understand the energy transition from different perspectives, and really have an open and informal conversation about these topics. So I am from the city of Brasilia, and I moved here to New York in 2019 to pursue my master's at Columbia University in energy policy. But some of the topics I'm most passionate about are related to energy access, to the just energy transition, and also to different areas of technology in Latin America, such as offshore wind and green hydrogen. But at the moment, I'm working at a think tank here called RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I also work for Student Energy, which I always love talking in these events about, because if any of you are interested in the energy sector and you want to gain more skills related to energy, definitely check them out. And I can put the link here later for some of you to take a look at it, but we are a global youth-led organization providing skills to young people, also supporting with delegations to COP and other high-level events, and doing a lot of great stuff. So without further ado, I want to introduce my two great friends who are here today. Maybe I'll start with you, Hugo, for a quick introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Eduarda, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think once Eduarda invites me to something, I have to say yes. So it really was a pleasure to come speak with you. But like she mentioned already, I'm Nigerian. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, which is where I grew up. I started my career in Nigeria as well, where I was working in consulting for about 3 years. And then I moved to the UN and moved to New York in 2020, so about 3 years ago, to work on clean energy policy, to work on SDG 7 essentially, because the organization I was working with was focused on SDG 7. For those of you who may not be aware, although I hope you all are, SDG 7 is the Sustainable Development Goal that focuses on universal access to energy. And so as you can imagine, a lot of our work was focused on energy access policy, energy transition policy, but also financing the energy transition as well. And so those are some of the areas that my energy interests cut across. Very interested in energy access, obviously being from Nigeria. I think there's a lot of opportunity to double down on that as we transition. And so I would hope to speak about some of that a bit more. But beyond that as well is also financing the transition. And so last year I left the UN and I joined Columbia. I'm actually at Columbia Business School now, where a lot of my work is looking at the intersection of energy, climate, and finance. Because I believe ultimately we need to double down on how much capital we're deploying if we really want to hit the net zero targets by 2050, 2060, depending on what target your government has set. So I'll leave it there for now, but happy to go into some of these interests in more detail as we have the conversation.
Thank you, Hugo. Lily, maybe you can go next.
Yes, so good morning. I'm also really excited to be here talking to you about topics I'm passionate about, and especially with my great friends I really enjoy talking to and learning from. So thanks so much for the invitation to that. I'm a master's student now studying energy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And I'm also working at the university's Energy Center on Global Energy Policy, on issues ranging from geopolitics of energy transition to energy systems modeling. And I'm especially interested in topics like sustainable mobility and critical minerals. And before starting my studies at Columbia, I was an energy modeler at the International Energy Agency based in Paris. And I was looking at different pathways to decarbonize and reach net zero, and how governments could do more to accelerate that transition. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Lillian. As you can see, they're both incredible people that I'm a big fan of. So I'm very happy they're here and that you're having a chance to hear firsthand about their experiences. Maybe I'll start with you then, Lily, and this is a question for both of you. If you could talk a little bit about how do you see the energy transition in your regions and even providing a global perspective. I think someone has their mic on. Márcio, thank you. So if you, Lily, maybe you can start and then we pass on to Hugo and then I'll add some additional perspectives to the idea of an energy transition.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think even within Asia, there are so many different approaches and diverging pathway to energy transition that's happening. But to set the scene first, I think to decarbonize and to have this successful energy transition in an affordable and reliable way, I think three things should happen. First is efficiency, electrification, and then supply side decarbonization, these three. And what I mean by all this is that I think first, using energy as efficiently as possible is very important. And then second, we need to electrify everything that makes sense to electrify, because it relates to the first point. Electrification is the most efficient way to use energy in the sense that there is less energy lost during this transformation. But we need to be aware that not everything makes sense to electrify. And in some cases, it could be very expensive. This is why the third part, this supply side decarbonization, come into the picture. So this bucket would include all the new, fancy, sexy technologies we talk about, from hydrogen to carbon capture and so on. So with this framework, I think different countries in Asia get different scorecards. But I think often efficiency, which should be the first priority, is often an important component that countries miss out. And countries tend to jump on focusing on power sector decarbonization, like moving away from coal. And this is, of course, very important. But without having all the infrastructures in place and following the steps and thinking about different end users it could reach, I think there's a risk of not having an affordable or just transition. So the energy transition might be more expensive than what it could have been. And also, like in any other region, but especially in Asia, we're not really the first region that pops into people's mind when you say a resource-rich region, maybe more so Middle East or North America. So innovation and geopolitics are very important to Asia, and it will continue to be our focus, I believe. And for instance, looking at especially South Korea and Japan, we import most of our energy resources. We're actually a very energy poor country. And this ripple effect of Ukraine crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and supply shifting to different regions of the world has affected these two countries a lot. And that's also in a way why Korea and Japan's decarbonization strategy heavily features on batteries or hydrogen. Innovation is a big thing. And also this is how these two countries are planning to have some geopolitics card under their sleeves to have some leverage in this transition. And if we travel slightly further and look at China, for instance, huge landmass, strong domestic market, more energy resources to use. So again, it's a very different story that's playing out. And same with Southeast Asia, another different story, lower income, but more resources at hand. So this is all to say that Asia is one region, but with lots of different economic and resource portfolios. And this is something we need to keep in mind when we think about and talk about energy transition.
Very, very well said, Lily. And I just a point that you raised about how much governments forget about efficiency. This is the same for I think for Brazil and a lot of countries in Latin America, where we're resource-rich countries that have a very clean energy matrix. Most of the time, we already are in a comfortable position, right? So we believe that we're already reached the energy transition, we're already there. And then what else can we do? So we focus a lot on industry, transportation, and efficiency, but not as much as the emphasis we give to the fact that we already have a clean matrix. So that sometimes is a reason I see it, international events or governments saying, well, we're in a good position. We don't have to do much more. So I think that that's interesting. And then a point that you brought about electrification, and then maybe that's a good segue to go back to you, Hugo. It's interesting how, working in different places, especially we're all now based in the US, how much they talk about electric vehicles and how much we have to electrify everything. And sometimes that's not necessarily a reality in some of our regions. And I get asked all the time in Brazil, like, why do we need to do it? We have a lot of biofuels. We already have, we don't emit greenhouse gases as much as other nations that should be doing this transition quicker. So maybe can you talk about that, considering we both worked for an organization that the CEO used to say, if you don't have access to energy, how are you going to transition if you don't even have the access? So I would love to hear your views.
Sure. No, I'll definitely, speak about energy access in a bit more detail. But I think just building on the question Lily was answering as well, maybe starting with a global view before I talk about Nigeria, and maybe looking at it across different sectors. So 100% agree with everything Lily has said. If I think about the different sectors that need to be transitioned, because I believe the transition has to be holistic. So first of all, you have power, which Lily mentioned. I think the big challenge there is, displacing sources of electricity like coal and natural gas. Obviously, we have a lot of technologies coming up, so wind, solar, etc. But as you know, a lot of these sources are intermittent in the sense that, we don't have them throughout the day. And so I think storage is a big challenge for the world right now as it relates to tapping into those sources. But I think beyond that, in my opinion, if we're really going to hit our net zero targets, we also need to look at some other technologies that can actually handle base load that we can then combine with intermittent. And so these are things like hydrogen, which is still very much emerging. Things like nuclear as well. I know people are sensitive around nuclear, but there's a lot of work being done around those technologies, because ultimately, I think we need an energy mix that features all of these different things, right? So hydrogen, nuclear, but also solar, wind enabled by storage to really hit the transition. So that's the power sector. I think after the power sector, then there's buildings. And I think people don't talk about buildings enough, because when you actually look at data in a lot of countries, buildings are the second largest sources of emissions. Buildings being both residential and commercial buildings. And so when you look at buildings, some of the big sources of carbon emissions there are things like clean cooking, which again doesn't get a lot of attention. And not just clean cooking in the global south where we use firewood, but even clean cooking in places like New York, where most of us still use gas to cook, right? Can we electrify things like that? To what Lily was saying. Beyond cooking as well is also things like, alternative refrigerants. We use a lot of cooling in our buildings for our refrigerators, for our air conditioners, if you live, in warm temperatures like where I grew up. But a lot of that is also heavily emitting technologies, right? And so moving away from those towards alternative refrigerants as well has to be a key part of the energy transition globally. Beyond the power sector and buildings, I would also say industry and transport are the other two. And so I think, again, Lily started to touch on some of the elements of that. The transport side, you have things like e-mobility. Industry, you need to electrify a lot of processes, but the industry is also right now very heavy on oil and gas for a lot of its energy. And so again, these are where things like hydrogen need to come in. And so that's how I think, at least at a global level, those are the four sectors that we really need to be thinking about. Obviously, as you get to a national level, different priorities matter more for different countries, depending on their energy mix, etc. But I think unless we really think about the energy transition in that holistic way, where we're coming up with, solutions across, power, industry, buildings, and also transport, we're really not going to hit the net zero target. I think in terms of then my own country personally, so bringing it to a local level, Nigeria, I would say there are two main challenges we face. The first is what Eduardo started to talk about, which is energy access. And so if you think about it, right now, I think there's about 600 to 700 million people in the world that don't have access to energy. And when I say 600, 700, I mean electricity. If you look at clean cooking, the number is even higher, right? And obviously, these people are still finding ways to survive. So if I speak about Nigeria, for example, a lot of people are cooking with firewood. A lot of us have these really noisy generator sets in our buildings that we use to power our buildings with a lot of diesel and things like that. And so all of those things need to be displaced. Otherwise, we're not hitting our net zero targets. And the only way those can be displaced is if the broader energy system provides energy to everybody. And so as it relates to Nigeria and probably the most of Africa, there really is no energy transition without energy access. It's just as simple as that. Right now, we're not emitting that much relative to other geographies. But as other geographies, start to hit their net zero goals, I think a lot of it is going to shift to Africa if we haven't been given energy access, because people still need energy to survive. And so energy access is such a big part of Africa's energy transition story. Just because, right now we're not emitting that much, but unless we fix that, people will continue to find some of these alternative sources or alternative ways to give themselves energy that will be harmful for the climate. The second piece I'll talk about as it relates to Nigeria, and this is something people don't really talk about that much because it's a very unique challenge, is for a country like Nigeria, an energy transition is not just an energy transition. It's also a transition of our economy, our entire economy. Right now, oil and gas accounts for about 80% of government revenues. And so if we're saying, oh, you need to move away from oil and gas, are we then saying, the government shouldn't be able to fund its budget? For a country that's already a developing economy, is already pretty tight on public finance, it's going to be an absolute disaster if, the point comes where the rest of the world isn't buying oil and gas from us, and we absolutely have no other way to raise funding, because then we can't even fund our energy transition. And I know this is a challenge that's not just unique to Nigeria. The other day, I was having an interview with the former energy minister in Colombia, and he was basically saying the same thing, right? There are some developing economies that face this challenge where it's not just about transitioning our energy system, but we also need to think about how the government continues to survive, given that a lot of government budget has been funded by oil and gas revenues. And so it's a really, really tricky challenge, for a country like mine. But at least we're seeing enough signs to suggest that, the government is taking it seriously. Young people like myself are taking it seriously. And we're really just hoping that, somewhere over the next few years, all of the different pieces are just going to come together to really help us achieve the transition.
Thank you, Hugo. Those are wonderful points. And definitely, I feel like I resonate also with this conversation I had with the former Minister of Energy in Colombia, because definitely it's not just about the energy systems, but how we finance the transition. And even though we have, and Colombia also has a relatively very, very clean energy matrix, but in Brazil, we also have Petrobras, which is a national oil company. And what in the discussions I have with young people, most of the time we're blaming a lot the international oil companies, which definitely have a huge responsibility to change their business, their portfolios and their business models and how they approach net zero. But at the same time, the national oil companies are also lagging behind, and very little of them have very bold ambitions on what to do in terms of decarbonization. And this is, shout out to Petrobras if they're listening to this. Yesterday I was in a panel with someone from Petrobras. I'm sure that they do great things, but at the same time, as we're here among young people and thinking about the future of our countries, I think we can always do more. But I'll go to you, Lily, and I think that all of these points also tie to, the quickly changing energy system and how where all the regions are connected somehow in terms of supply and demand. So I know that you've been doing a lot of work and research on what's happening now with Russia's invasion in Ukraine and how that has an effect all over the world. So please feel free to share anything that you've learned so far that would benefit the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting question that I've been devoting lots of my time on. So I've heard actually lots of debate on this topic, whether this Ukraine crisis has accelerated or decelerated the energy transition. And we're now 1 year in, and we have to acknowledge that Ukraine has shown remarkable strength and transatlantic unity between US and Europe has never been this strong on this topic. And also just Russia's whole calculus on how long the war will go on was also very off. So many things played out in a very unexpected way. And I do like the narrative that Ukraine war may have accelerated the clean energy transition. But when it comes to this, I think we need to look at it more regionally rather than globally. So there's no one specific answer that could be answered yes or no. But I think if we look at Europe and more so the Western world, Europe, US, maybe it could be a yes. Because as Europe was scrambling to move away from Russian energy, it was getting most of its gas from Russia, and Russian oil was also a big supply that comes into Europe. Europe has doubled down on its decarbonization commitment, and this is a huge feat on their part. They have a long-term energy plan that came out shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine called Repower EU, a very smart name. And it consists of how to fill this gap that Russian oil and gas accounted for with more resilient, clean, secure domestic energy. And also in the US, where Duda, Ugo, we're studying and we're working in IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, was a big news in the past year. It became a law in the US last year to everybody's surprise. And this law promises significant amount of investment and subsidies in the clean energy sector. And this, in a way, is a culmination of US determination to lead this clean energy transition. So great stories, great feats that has happened. But also what I'm wary of, and something that I don't actually hear as much in different discussions, is developing countries' perspective. Because to begin with, all the gas that was in the market that would have, in a normal situation, flowed into developing countries suddenly headed to Europe, because Europe could afford to pay more for a gas. So countries who cannot pay as much or compete in terms of price with Europe turned back to coal. And for instance, China recently speeded up approval of new coal power plants, and President Xi Jinping in China, they actually committed to stop building new coal plants abroad in 2021, 2 years ago. But actually, recently there was a research that has shown that China has built 14 new coal power plants since this commitment was made. And also, for instance, India, another huge economy, huge demand. India is also planning to expand its coal power plants by 2030. And this is a huge setback for climate. And another setback, which is what Hugo and Duda touched upon, but also energy access. So we talk about energy transition, but I very much agree that we cannot talk about a full energy transition unless there's 100% energy access in different parts of the world. And because of it's a combination of different things. Even before the war, there was a pandemic. So these two happening together, pandemic and the current energy crisis that became even worse by this war in Europe. IEA recently came up with this number that 75 million people are likely to lose access to electricity because of this ongoing crisis. And to sum up, so I think it's a very difficult question to answer in either just yes or no, because of how many different fronts of war or how many different fronts the war has touched upon. But I think something that I can say for sure is that the war has changed the way the world thinks about energy transition and about the energy. So energy security is back on the table. It's trendy to talk about it again. So there are more conversations about the origins of the energy sources. Where is this oil coming from? Where is this gas coming from? And more conversations on industrial policy, which is a huge change from the pre-war period. And this is being intensified now with the ongoing trade tension between the US and China, the two biggest economies in the world. And how this geopolitics will play out is something to pay attention, something that we all should pay attention in the coming years. But I just hope that countries would make a wise decision to collaborate where they can and compete where it's needed, because it's really an important moment, all hands on the deck situation, and we cannot really let geopolitics get in the way of making progress in combating climate change. So yes, that's my 2 cents.
No, that's wonderful, Lillian. And, you know, it's interesting how you mentioned like the impact of the war on developing countries. And I also don't hear anything about that. Definitely, like, these are different perspectives. And recently, I even wrote something about, you know, the relationship between energy security and justice, because while we're discussing that people are, you know, energy is getting more expensive, what is really happening to the countries that can't afford to have this like backup supply? So what's happening in Europe is that they can come up with a solution, right? Or the state has enough money to subsidize energy access to the populations that are more vulnerable in their own countries, in Germany and in the UK. But what happens with other countries is that energy becomes just so expensive that a lot of people that had access no longer have access. And I can bring this also to the perspective of what's happening in Brazil, that, you know, we heavily depend on roads for transportation of commodities and goods. So what this energy crisis has brought to my country, and I think to other countries that also have similar transportation modes and similar food systems, is that fuels have become more expensive, and then the government starts subsidizing fossil fuels even more, so that truck drivers and people who are, you know, bus drivers and everyone who's working in the transportation sector is able to afford it. So the government is actually spending lots more money on fossil fuels than they could have been using for the energy transition or green technologies. So it's interesting to see that also, and this goes back to politics, right? So this makes the government more or less popular if they're providing subsidies for fossil fuel, so that people can afford to still, you know, go to work using their cars and things like that. And then at the same time, you're also looking at increased food prices. So people that are already seeing inflation previously because of the COVID pandemic are seeing even more inflation because of the energy crisis, and they just don't really see how all of this is connected, right? But Ugo, just going back to you, I think starting to develop the idea of, you know, energy justice and these concepts of how the pandemic and the war in Ukraine affects our countries and our regions. If you can elaborate on that for us, would be great.
I would love to. And, you know, in fact, when Lily was speaking, I just kept shaking my head and smiling because everything she said is correct. I feel like the energy transition has become so geopolitical now that our leaders are just using it as a tool. And you know, you're an activist yourself, Edward, and so you know how we're constantly, you know, asking for one thing, but getting another. I feel like even my time at the UN, if anything, made me feel sad about where the world is headed. Because ultimately our leaders know how to say the right things to the public, but behind closed doors, you know, typically have agendas that they're solving for, which is pretty disappointing. I think to the topic Lily mentioned around energy security, obviously, I think energy security is very important. But again, what I just see a lot of people doing is a lot of leaders just using it as an excuse or as a cover to basically do everything that they really wanted to do, as opposed to what they told us they would do. So whether it's like coal plants going live, whether it's gas reserves being bought. I remember I was actually at the UN when, you know, the crisis in Ukraine started, and I was working with the team, kind of developing a crisis response. And unfortunately, one of the things we saw was, you know, while we expected some countries to double down on the transition, all they did was just find alternative sources of gas instead of Russia's gas. And so a lot of them turned to Africa. A lot of supply that African countries would have bought, you know, some European countries were able to buy because obviously they put in a higher bid, and, you know, the person who pays more always wins. a lot of countries that had said, oh, we're not going to finance any, non-clean technology or energy sources outside of, your country. We're only going to fund things nationally, not internationally, was some way of, again, pretending to do something, but not really doing anything, because you don't really invest in developing economies anyways. And so if you say, oh, I'm not investing internationally, it's maybe like 10% of how much you're investing in like oil and gas or coal every year. But then you're still continuing to invest so much in your home country under the tag of energy security. So, I mean, the two things that I've learned from that is, on the one hand, the energy transition, unfortunately, has become very, very geopolitical, in the sense that right now, a lot of our leaders are just using it as a tool to kind of have their national battles and kind of, power plays and things like that, which is really, really unfortunate, because it's affecting lives on the ground. So that's one. But I think the second thing is then just that we need to look at ourselves to solve our problems. And this is one of the things that makes me really happy to get on this kind of calls, where a lot of young people are really thinking about how we shape the future we want. Because ultimately, there's a growing wave of nationalism globally. Everyone is looking at their country first, whether that affects other countries or not. A lot of people don't really care that much. It's like, oh, I'm responsible for my people, etc. And so that means we need to look inwards as well as young people, to hold our leaders accountable, but also to say, how do our interests, how do our skills actually align to getting our country where we want? And so, if you feel like you have great ideas, that you feel like entrepreneurial companies you want to run, just get out there and start it, right? If your interest is in finance, figure out how you can, get a job in finance to move capital towards, some of these projects that people are implementing. If you're very passionate about politics, policy, become like Eduarda, who's an amazing kind of climate and energy champion, and who, I have no doubt would take a big role in office someday. Because ultimately it's up to us now, right? I wish it wasn't the case, because I wish, we could continue to stay together as a globe, and continue to help each other get to the net zero targets together. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening, at least, or it doesn't look like that's what's going to happen, right? And so I think as we think about energy justice, there's just a lot that needs to be solved on the ground. So, we talked about energy access, and how that has a ripple effect into things like health, education, economic productivity, etc. Unless we really double down on trying to solve our problems, unfortunately, it's not looking like we're going to get that much help. Because even when you think about like capital that's flowing anywhere, I think there was a statistic around, looking at Africa on its own, only maybe about 1 to 5% of global investment in like clean energy technologies over the last year actually went to Africa. So it doesn't sound like anyone is taking the challenge of energy access very seriously. Like, no one is funding it. And that's really disappointing. One other thing I'll mention is just around like the disconnect between finance and projects. And maybe that's something I'm also trying to like focus on now, where, when you speak to a lot of investors, especially in like global markets like New York, London, they tell you there's no projects to fund. When I was in the UN, I was working with governments to help them think through projects, but we couldn't find capital. And so I feel like there's projects on one hand, there's capital on the other hand, but somewhere in the middle, there's a disconnect. Right now I'm spending a lot of my time at Columbia trying to figure out what that disconnect is, and how I can play my own part in kind of moving capital to where it's needed most, from these international markets. Because unfortunately, if the energy transition is going to cost us billions, I don't think we have capital markets in our countries that are deep enough to fund that. But I think while we think of those bigger plans of making the world work together, moving capital from one place to the other, as it relates to like energy justice and energy access and just getting things done on the ground, I think we really need to start to look inwardly, because unfortunately we're just not getting the support we need from other countries. And so we can either like wait for that support to come or just roll up our sleeves. Eduarda spoke about student energy, and I'll wrap it up here, but Eduarda spoke about student energy. This is an organization I worked with a lot when I was at the UN. There were so many other similar youth-led organizations I worked with that just showed me how young people are actually making the difference on ground, right? So whether it's like starting companies that are doing the technologies, whether it's trying to get into office, whether it's raising funds as well. I think even student energy raised the fund and has started to deploy capital. So there's a lot going on in our ecosystem of young people and youth to really tackle the energy justice challenges we're seeing, because unfortunately our leaders are not taking it as seriously. And so we really need to continue to ask ourselves, what can we do every day to make the difference, because the longer we wait, the longer it's going to take, because it doesn't look like anyone else is really willing to solve the challenges for us.
Definitely, Hugo, and also shout out to ENERGIA, who's organizing the event, because they're also a platform in Brazil to share knowledge about the energy sector and also provide mentorship. So definitely, I think that we sometimes see more action coming from the youth side than actually our governments. But just to go back to a point where I think I love this topic of like, okay, when I worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, we also talked so much about the lack of good bankable projects. And I think that there definitely is a gap between capital available, good projects, and the negotiations that happen behind closed doors of how we're going to finance these energy projects. And I wanted to bring a concept that I came across yesterday from Sonia Guajajara, who is an indigenous leader in Brazil and now our Minister of Indigenous People in Brazil. And she talked about green colonialism, which I loved how she phrased it, because I've been seeing it for many years now. But I like the idea of having a name for it, because I feel like most of the time when we're working with the divide of global north, global south, there is this very like strong view of the global north will provide the technologies, will provide the access, will provide the knowledge to the global south, that sometimes we forget that we could also, you know, that South-South cooperation exists, that we can help each other in ways that make sense for our communities. But I think that what's interesting is that the wrong perception of risk and how, you know, and how companies, especially risk agency companies, might be doing their risk assessment in a way that puts global south countries in a bad position for investments. And most of the time, the people doing, and this is something I've discussed, I think, with Lily and maybe even with Hugo, that like we had a class at Columbia that discusses this, and the professor was talking about how the people in risk agencies are, you know, sitting in London or New York, even though they're from different countries, they have a very different life from the people who are in communities trying to put together these projects. And then the way that they assess risk is very different from how risk is itself in our countries. And that definitely affects the way that investors look at it, because obviously they don't want they want to find investment grade countries or projects to invest on. And then this has a lot of effects on the finance available for the energy transition in developing countries. So definitely another way of young people, you know, moving into these sectors, working not just if you're interested in finance, but going to like risk agencies or insurance companies and asset managers, because I think that it's a view that we need more young people to integrate these spaces. We need them to be working in these spaces to bring this type of knowledge and awareness, and even to the multilaterals. Just bringing in lastly, a topic that's, you know, traveling, everyone's discussing now the multilateral development bank reforms. And it's, again, very interesting how we're talking about the way that they provide debt, the way that they provide finance. But for me personally, I think that we also have to think about restructuring these banks, bringing in more people from developing countries to be in leadership position in these banks, because once again, the way the structure and the governance of most of these banks, who makes the decisions to provide funding or not, are a board of governors, which are composed of developed countries, which are, you know, government of countries in Scandinavia, government of Canada, government of Australia. These are the people ultimately making decisions for multilateral development banks. So I think that we're still operating in a logic post-World War II and also Cold War logic, where we still have countries which are providing everything, the support, the knowledge, the assistance, the countries receiving it. When I think we came to a point where, you know, I look at like Nigeria, I look at Brazil, India, and other emerging markets that are already doing great things for the energy sector, and we rarely ever acknowledge it. But this is a lot, I think, to unpack. I'll move back to Lily, because I think we have some time, and Lily mentioned that she does, you know, research on critical minerals, which when we're discussing energy justice, when we're discussing geopolitics in the energy sector, I think, once again, when we discuss critical minerals, we rarely ever look at communities being affected by the extraction of these minerals, and considering that a lot of the available lithium is in South America, people don't mention Brazil, but Brazil has, I think, is in the top 10 reserves in the world. Lily, you're going to know more, but I know Brazil has a lot of lithium reserves. But definitely something that we don't discuss is how mining is affecting our communities. But I'll pass it on to you, Lily, to make some remarks.
Sure, thank you. Yes, Brazil, lithium, but also copper. And we say copper is I think it's top 3 copper producing country. And copper is, we call it a mineral of electrification. So very important role that Brazil plays. And like Duda mentioned, I think what people often forget in the discussion is how important these minerals are and how important role they have played in this rise of many clean energy technologies that we depend on today. So from solar panels to wind turbines and all the electricity lines, transmission grids, and electric vehicles we always talk about, we need minerals. I think I read in one of the news the headline saying from the age of oil to the age of shovel, something like that. So ensuring that these and other clean energy technologies can continue to draw on sufficient mineral supplies is very important to continue this energy transition. And this at the same time is a very big challenge. Just to draw a picture of what the magnitude is that we need in this IEA scenario that shows how do we get to net zero emissions by 2050, global net zero emissions by 2050. Apparently, we need at least 4 times higher demand. There will be a 4 times higher demand of all the critical minerals that goes into clean energy technology already by 2030 compared to today. So we need to ramp up 4 times more from what we have today to meet the demand by then. And as we talked today about the pandemic and how the last year's Ukraine crisis have in a way shown global supply chain is very fragile. So any potential disruption to this mineral supply chains, it could easily undermine the pace of energy transition. And this could, in a way, pose threat to energy security as well. And like Duda mentioned, this minerals is also an interesting piece because the current production of these many energy transition minerals is actually even more geographically concentrated than oil or natural gas. And when we think of geopolitical concentration, we easily go to this oil cartel, OPEC, and how it's very much concentrated in the Middle East. But actually, when we look at clean energy, in some cases, it's even worse. Like certain key minerals concentrated in few regions, like lithium. Lithium is very important to any of the clean energy technology I mentioned earlier, especially energy storage, battery that Hugo mentioned. Lithium plays a key part. And 3 countries, Australia, Chile, and China, they actually account for almost 90% of the global share, compared to oil and gas. Usually top 3 producing countries, each of them account for around 10%, 15% of the global share. So 45%. So it's less than 50% when you look at top 3 producing countries. But for lithium, it's 90%. That's a huge share. And when we look at processing of lithium, not just extraction, but processing lithium to be made in a more usable form, this is even more concentrated, with China alone accounting for almost 60%. And if we look at top 3 countries in this processing part of the value chain, it's more than 90%. So how this minerals piece will play out would be also an important determinant of the energy transition.
Yes, no, Lily, thank you for that. And I think that, critical minerals also play a very important role in the US-China competition. So I think that, going back to the concept of, green colonialism and like energy justice and how little we're discussing the impacts of extracting these minerals for people, because most of the time mining requires a lot of water. And usually lithium is available in places of the world where you either have deserts or you either have problems with water scarcity or land use. So in Chile, I know that there's a lot of land use conflicts happening because of lithium extraction and processing. So I think that we rarely ever discuss that. I think the US and China are a lot more focused on supply shortage, on the fact that if we want to reach the transition, like you said, you need 4 times more critical minerals than we have today. So where is the supply? We're worried that there won't be enough supply for all the demand that is coming up for renewable energy, especially. But I wanted to now go back to you, Hugo. There's a question in the chat that I think it would be great for you to answer from Givia Melo. Is funding for access to renewable energy really a solution, especially when you have so many people without access to basic energy? So Hugo, if you can talk maybe about some, financing models for energy access in Nigeria and in Africa, like that would be super helpful, I think, for the audience.
Sure. and maybe I'll talk about it from 2 sides. I think one, the supply side, and then also the demand side, which is more consumer focused. I think on the supply side, a big goal has to be reducing the cost of energy for everyone, right? To make it more accessible. And as we're seeing, a lot of the, renewable sources, the clean sources are that much cheaper. So if I understand your question correctly, it's like, should we be focusing on providing, renewable energy when energy as a whole is really lacking? And I would say yes, because providing renewable energy means we're able to supply energy at a lower cost to people. Obviously, there are a lot of other things that factored into this as well, right? Like, the cost of capital for the project. So whoever is building like the mini grid, whatever, they also have to have a low cost of capital. If not, they're just going to pass on the high cost to the consumer. So that doesn't really help anyone. But as we're seeing, a lot of renewable energy technologies are actually able to provide energy at a much lower cost to a lot of people. For a lot of people in Nigeria, for example, that maybe they have energy, but they've had to provide energy for themselves. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are using these generator sets. I don't know if you have them in Brazil, but they're just these noisy boxes in your house that use a lot of diesel and generate electricity for you. And a lot of the data we've seen is actually showing that it's a lot cheaper when, for example, you install a mini grid in a community and use that to power people to displace the generators. Like the cost per kilowatt hour is just so much cheaper than a lot of the alternatives people are using right now. And so that's the first thing I'll say, to say that, like, as we're providing energy, we also need to think about providing renewable energy, just because the data is showing that renewable energy is just much cheaper, right? And lowering the cost of energy has to be an important consideration for energy security and energy justice, as we've spoken about. The other part is then actually the demand side, which is then saying, how can the customer even pay for this, right? And I think there are a lot of innovative models that we're seeing, on the continent of Africa, for example, which is why I also kept hounding at the beginning that we also need to start to solve our own problems. Because the challenges that we face on the continent, in many ways, some of the more developed economies are just not used to, or at least maybe they were used to it, but maybe it was like 150 years ago. And so they really can't provide solutions that are fit for our purposes. And so some examples of that is something we call like pay as you go, where someone might get like a solar home system in their house, or a community might come together to kind of build some kind of microgrid. And essentially what the supplier does is they lease it to the person who's using the energy to own it. So as opposed to having to pay upfront for the entire cost of the system, you pay maybe over 2 to 3 to 4 years to complete the entire payment. And then once you complete the payment, it becomes your own, right? That's not something I've seen anywhere else, especially in the developed economies, but it's something that's really prevalent across Africa. Also building on a lot of innovations we've made on the continent around things like financial technology, right? So people are even able to pay for these systems from their phones, from their homes, and get electricity. But then just that pay-as-you-go model where they're able to pay for these systems over time is something that really helps. One thing I would say, though, is with a lot of these pay-as-you-go systems, there's been a lot of debate around what actually classifies as energy that's good enough, right? Is it okay to say I'm giving someone energy to electrify just their phone and like a light? Or do I want to give them energy that, means, maybe they can go to school and come back and like plug in their computer to work, or have a refrigerator as well, where they can, store food and food isn't wasting, or, they can turn on the TV and see what's going on with the rest of the world. And so I think as much as, these smaller system and pay-as-you-go models have made energy very much more accessible to a lot of people, I think we also need to continue to think about, what is the minimum amount of energy that we need to give to someone that is reasonable, right? It's not enough to say, oh, I'm giving someone something that is a solar light. So, oh yes, it's solar, it's clean, it's renewable, but it's just a light bulb. Like, that's not where we are. The world is moving beyond that. As we think about connecting the rest of, the emerging economies to the broader global economy, we need to think about not just providing them clean energy, but providing them the right amount of clean energy, right? And so a lot of these models that I spoke about, like pay-as-you-go, are models that people are actually innovating around to make, clean energy more accessible. But there are still some of these risks just around, like, if you're providing smaller systems, how can you make sure you're still giving people enough energy? The other thing I'll just mention very quickly around demand side is also electrifying productive use. And this is a debate I had with, one of my friends who doesn't really believe in, like, some of these smaller systems. He says, oh, some people, when you give them this energy, they can't even pay for it. So like, what's the point, etc. And the answer I always give is, the problem isn't the energy system that you're providing them in itself. So it's not the solar home system or the mini grid or the microgrid that is the problem to why people can pay. It's the fact that they don't really have sources of income to then be able to afford to pay for that electricity. And so what we've been seeing a lot of people do, in Nigeria, and I think even in the broader continent as well, is electrifying productive use. Because when you speak to a lot of these people, they tell you things like, oh, if you pay, or if you provide me energy for like my farm, or, for my business, then that's going to help me increase my income. And then I can afford to electrify my home as well, right? And so it's not just thinking about, the right amount of energy being provided or the model you're using to make them be able to afford it, but also thinking about what you're electrifying, right? If someone is completely unemployed, maybe the first place to start isn't by giving them energy at home. Maybe it's by giving them some kind of productive use that they can make with the energy, such that they start to earn an income, and then they're able to afford to energize their homes. And so I know I've said a lot, maybe just in a nutshell, all I've said is, I think in providing energy, it definitely has to be renewable, because renewable is just that much cheaper now. And affordability is such a big thing as it relates to energy access and energy justice. But then also on the demand side, there are a lot of models that are making it work, right? So, this pay-as-you-go model that I spoke about, electrifying productive use, just because we're trying to get people out of energy poverty, right? And energy poverty is very closely tied to economic poverty in many ways. And so we really need to start thinking holistically about the solutions we're providing and making sure they are fit for purpose.
That was a perfect explanation, Hugo. Thank you. And I specifically asked him to talk about pay-as-you-go because as I was, working with it and studying it, I always thought it would be such a viable solution in Brazil. And I think that, Nigeria, Kenya, and other African countries are doing such an excellent job in reaching vulnerable communities in remote locations. And this is like a great way for us to do it that doesn't necessarily rely on the government, but that we can involve the private sector. So definitely for those of you listening right now, take a look at it because this is something I would love to see happening in Brazil and in Latin America. I think that in our region, only Peru does it, and in a very small scale, not comparable to Africa yet. But as we're, walking to our last few minutes here, maybe I'll just ask both of you, and starting with you, Lily, what's your last call to action? How can we reach net zero? How can we solve all the problems in the energy sector at this moment? But maybe a recommendation for you, for everyone who's listening, that you think could be prioritized at the moment. And then you, Hugo, you can start thinking about it.
Thank you. That's a multi-billion-dollar question. First, to begin with, I think Hugo made a great point about this point on not just giving energy access to people, but the fact that we should also think about how much energy is needed for people to sustain their life. I've recently come across an initiative by, I think, Energy for Growth Hub on a concept called modern energy minimum. So it's a new concept that brings in this minimum amount of energy that is needed to sustain modern life. So not just energy access that would continue energy poverty, but actually real energy access that would provide enough energy for a modern life was the concept. And I think it's also very important topic that should be discussed more. And to your question, Duda, I think we've talked about some of the challenges in our conversation today, from geopolitics to just transition. And something I think it's very important, and I think that by having this conversation with people from 3 different continents is a great start. I think it is very important to engage with local communities and organizations, and having more local experts and local youth interested in this topic. I think that's one of the things that's very important to get us to net zero or somewhere near net zero by 2050. I think, as I mentioned before, I think lots of discussions, as we talked about, lots of discussions about energy transition is still focused on and is being told in the perspective of advanced economies. And I think we need to change this narrative to include the diverse perspectives, the diverse transitions that's going on. It's not one transition, but it's going to be a different transition in each country, region of each country, and so on. And I think oftentimes it is a case where advanced economies would try to apply their success stories to developing economies without really considering the local situations. I'm not saying this to blame advanced economies, but that's also just how human brains work, that you tend to think only based on your experience. So I think the money that we need is actually there. It's flowing into the energy sector at the right time. And I also see the will growing, the money will grow, but we need to make sure that it flows into the right place to make the most impact. And in order to do so, I think we need to engage local experts to tell the financiers what they need and how it should work in their region. And this is where youth, us, really play an important role. This is something that will really govern our future for years to come. So learning about this, being interested in this topic would be something that would be crucial to the success of energy transition. So again, thank you for this initiative and discussion today. And yes, I'll hand it over to you, Go.
And thanks, Lily. I think I'll also try to wrap up with, some kind of call to action to say, first of all, there is a really big space, in which we can play. I know when we talk about the energy transition, it sounds very high level, sounds very fluffy, It can also sound very overwhelming for people who are interested, but don't really know where to start. But there's a very big space to play, right? I think at the beginning of the call, I spoke about just the different sectoral views. So all the way from power to like buildings to transport and industry. But even within those, there's just so many technologies as well. Recently, I was consulting for a company and we helped them analyze as many as like 50 different technologies, pathways that actually would help us get to net zero, all the way from things we already know like storage, solar, wind, hydrogen, to other things like, alternative refrigerants, etc. Like there's a very big list. And even when you take that down further, right, within the list of, okay, how do we get all these pathways where we need to go, or these technologies, there's different areas you can get involved, right? There's a lot of financing thinking that needs to happen. There's a lot of policy thinking that needs to happen. A lot of these technologies are not where we need them to be either. I think hydrogen has immense potential, but the technology readiness level is still very far behind compared to a lot of technologies. And so there's a lot of space to play. I know it can sound overwhelming when you just hear energy transition. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to even understand what that means because it means so many different things. But all I'm saying is, there's a big space to play. And so I think we can do well by continuing to, discover what we find interesting, what we're passionate about, and then build those skills so that in many ways we can start to contribute towards the different pieces. because there's just so many pieces and so much work to do that unless we really think holistically and actually have people, smart people, passionate people, driven people, really like trying to solve each of these different challenges, we're just not going to get to where we need to be. And so it's a call for all of us to kind of figure out what we're passionate about, where we want to play, and then just roll up our sleeves and do it, right? I think if anything I've learned over the last 3 years, just again, engaging with young people like myself, is people are doing like really amazing things. A lot of people are not waiting to be given permission. A lot of people are just doing. And in many ways, I've also noticed that when you start to do, governments start to take you seriously as well. Private sector, big players start to take you seriously as well. And so just figure out where you're passionate about, where you think you want to fit, and then just roll up your sleeve and do, because there's so much work to be done. And so we just need as many people at the table as we can get.
I think there's nothing left for me to say. I think those are incredible calls to action. And I really want to thank both of you for participating today. And thank everyone else who's listening. Please do follow them on social media, on LinkedIn. They are incredible people that I always look after for, advice in life, but also energy knowledge, who have lived experiences, hands-on experiences as well. So thank you both so much, Hugo and Lily, and thank you for Energy C for organizing and having us today. Hope you have a great rest of your week and weekends. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.